I'll say it once again. Oh, life. Grand reveal.
Good morning. I guess. If I have to.
I'm here. I need to look. Okay. My t-shirt, unless I'm going for the layered look. All of my sweaters need to get blocked down, or I need to tuck my t-shirt in, and that's so 80s. I need to block this sweater. I was about to say I'm here, and then I got distracted. That's not a thing.
No.
I have hopes of blocking this to see if I can. I have more yarn. I could keep going, but I don't want to rip out a mohair bind off. I have hopes of blocking this lovely, lovely sweater that you probably can't see the sparkles on camera. To see if I can get a little longer. Some aggressive blocking lengthwise, not widthwise. If I ever get around to it, you know I will report the results to you right here. Good morning. Welcome to a mellower, at least for right now, edition of the Sun Dragon Sideshow. What?
It's like Monday all over again.
But it's Thursday. Okay, let's try this again. Welcome to the Sun Dragon Sideshow.
The Dear Becky and Lizzy edition.
Yes. Oh, did I mention we don't have show notes?
Ever.
Yeah. And look, I'm going to go off camera. I'm going to slide over a little. We're not going to mess with the camera again. I don't know. We thought maybe it was in the right spot, but I feel like I'm drifting. That's okay.
We do rearrange our chairs during the day.
Yeah. It does happen. So I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in not too chilly but rainy downtown Brevard, North Carolina.
I'm Liz. I'm the Minion there.
You're just like, yo, no. I'm here.
I'm here.
No. I think it's funny that I always talk about the weather. I think it's because I talk first because you're the weather person. So I can observe what's happening out the window. I'm one of those. What's it like? What's the weather? Go look out the window.
Go look out the window.
And Liz will have all the stats and facts and what's going to happen and, you know, how cold it's going to get in February and things like that. So, yeah.
Cold. It's going to clear off. And, you know.
Today or in February?
Today.
Okay. Yeah, it is. It's supposed to be a decent weekend, which is good. But because we'll be inside on Saturday talking to you all on camera, on Facebook and Zoom. That's what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, that other thing.
That other thing that I use like so many times a week, and we actually filmed this on. This is a Zoom meeting for one. Secrets. Revealing secrets. Behind the scenes. Inner workings. Y'all get that by watching us. Yeah. It's because we already talked about it. I brought it up. Let's get it out of the way now. Please join us on Saturday.
Yes.
January 23rd. For our dual platform side-by-side Saturday afternoon sit and stitch.
I'm just checking my phone to see if we have any last minute Dear Becky and Lizzy's.
I'm getting fuzz that was stuck in my mask out of my mouth, and then I'm going to hand sanitize.
Hand sanitizer would be good.
Uh-huh. And
nope.
I wipe my nose before I hand sanitize. There we go. All with one shot then. No, we're making up our own Dear Becky and Lizzy adjacent things today. And then we have new products that are not part of the product of the week thing that we can show you. So remember,
we did get a comment, but we're going to save that.
Well, no, we got a comment. I'll address the comment. We got a comment about that I think was relating to how about picking out a yarn for a pattern you already have, like substitutions. And I think we've addressed that fairly recently. If I figure out which Dear Becky and Lizzy it was in, I'll put it in the comments. But I think we had a yarn substitution video not too long ago. About like look for at least the same weight, maybe the same fiber, there's still difficulty within weight categories of finding just the right yarn, which means test your gauge.
Always.
Which transitions us to what I've either noticed on Knit and Chat and I keep touching my mouth. Don't worry, Liz, when we're done filming, before I get anywhere near you, I will hand sanitize again. Before I get to any customers. We do this a lot. We wash hands as much as we can, but we do this a lot. And the crazy thing about doing this a lot is you brought in these big, huge Purell dispensers.
I bought them before or right as the world was falling apart.
Before there was a shortage of hand sanitizer, and we've got we have 3 of them. 3 of them? Only 3 of them. Wow. And each one of them is at like halfway right now. Part of that's because we limit traffic flow in here. And so even though we're using it all the time, we still have plenty left, which is kind of cool. So, and at this point, I think we could probably get hand sanitizer again. Yeah, you can, but not the Purell. I don't know why. I haven't found Purell anywhere. I found everybody else's off-brand because, like, that's weird. I was not aware.
The big.
We're like, brought to you by Purell.
Yeah.
We'd be supporting the company if you could buy it from them.
Yeah, I haven't found it. Of course, I'm not like looking at Walmart and some of the other places, but
we're looking at what can keep our bubble small and be shipped to us. Yeah. So, okay, to return to what I was saying. We get this question a lot with lessons and people wanting to make patterns of things because we always say test your gauge. And then people are like, okay, how do I do that? Or the biggest question, and I think we've addressed this too, the biggest question is, if my gauge is off, which direction do I go in to change my needles? Because again, my mantra is always, what you have control over is your needles, is your tool. It's your gauge, your tension, like how you hold the yarn, knitting tight or loose. I've seen people, or I've had comments from people of like, oh, I do this continental, I do this English style. Like they hold the yarn in different hands to do different techniques. For me, that completely changes my gauge, which again, I should back up in case I am putting the cart before the horse. Gauge is how the size of your stitches. It's your measurement, but not everyone knows all the lingo. So I don't want to make assumptions. And if I'm dumbing it down way too much for some of our audience, stick with us.
The reason that you want to test your gauge, how big or little your stitches are, is particularly for something that fits.
Yeah.
A shawl, not so much. But a hat, most people, like a lot of us, don't gauge swatch for hats.
It doesn't always work out. But
then we're like, why doesn't it fit? But it's a hat. So why would you swatch that?
It's just so small, but it can.
If you want a hat to fit.
Yeah.
Gloves. Socks.
Yeah.
Sweaters.
Things that need to fit, like Liz is saying, definitely. It's something that needs to come out the right size. So a sweater, like the one I'm wearing, this is the right size. I just lost the will to live on the length of it. That's the only issue I'm having with this. And it's not the end of the world. It does fit here. It's not too tight. It's not too loose. Yay. My fallback is, regardless of if it needs to fit or not, if you want it to look like it does in the pattern or come out to the size it is in the pattern.
Yes.
If you care, even if it's a shawl, you need to test your gauge. Assuming that, well, I'm using a worsted weight yarn, I can just use the size needle that the pattern writer did, can lead to sadness. It could be fine. It could lead to sadness. I have taken the gamble, and it's been fine many times. But yeah, gauge is, at least we're talking stitches this way, counting them. How many stitches fit into a certain area is gauge. And often they'll also do rows. Not always, but they'll do stitches this way, rows that way. And it'll be, okay, the pattern writer using size 7 needles with X, Y, or Z yarn, this is the gauge they got. This is how they got it to look the way it did.
And some of our knitters have found that certain pattern writers that they follow have either a looser or tighter gauge than they do. Like,
because someone will say, I'm an on-gauge knitter. Why didn't this work?
Yeah.
And on-gauge means, like, how I interpret that phrase is, if you look at a ball band, like if I grab this one it says suggested knitting gauge and needles. US, let's say US 9 needles. There's a range. I'm going to pick one. US 9 needles, 16 stitches over 4 inches, which is an on gauge knitter could pick up size 9 needles and knit something with this and come out to 16 stitches over 4 inches without much hesitation. That would happen. They consider themselves on gauge because they can do what it says on the label and it comes out the suggested size. But not all pattern writers are on
gauge.
Exactly. Not all pattern writers will have consistent gauge the same way that someone who thinks they're an on gauge, which means not super tight and not super loose in the general yarn world.
There was a shawl I did that it was an awesome shawl. I loved it. Loved the pattern. But it was like supposed to take 1,200 yards of worsted weight yarn. I was excited. Like biggest triangle shawl ever.
Like Liz hears that. Liz hears that and she's like, it's gonna be gymongous. I'm gonna love it.
It was fantastic. And I start knitting and I'm like, this is not gonna use up any. Like
she's like, I'm gonna be
like and it's not as big as it was advertised as. Like it kind of disappointed me.
Sounds like the person who wrote the pattern.
So I went to the projects.
Had a different thing.
And half of the projects used all the 1,200 yards and were like, this is the biggest shawl ever. And the other half of the projects used half the yarn and went, what? And somebody had commented and the pattern writer was like, well, it's a thing called gauge. And I'm like, 50% of your people aren't, like it wasn't working out. And I was like, it was okay. I altered the pattern and just kept doing repeats until I got 1,200 yards into it. But it's like gauge is important that everybody gets included, not just,
And I've seen patterns that don't have a gauge listed because they make assumptions that everyone knits like them. And that can work well or lead to sadness. Yep. My intro cable hat pattern that I use has no gauge listed and we take our chances. I mean, just because a pattern is not a well-written pattern does not mean I won't do it. Because it could still be something that looks really cool. It just means there could be challenges in trying to do it, right? And then we've had people come into the shop and say, my hats don't fit. My hats come out too big. What's the problem? And we say, this is a variant of what Liz has already said, and we said, did you test your gauge? No.
Oh no, I don't do that.
I don't do that. But why doesn't my hat fit? And I'm like, and shout out to Sarah Beth. We have knitters who will never gauge swatch, like will never test their gauge before they start a project. But she knows the risks. Like she doesn't want to do that. It's one of those, ain't nobody got time for that. And I'm of the philosophy of yes, it takes time before you start to make sure that you're hitting gauge, but that's less time than if you make it and it's coming out massively crazy and you have to redo it. That's a lot of time too.
I take a gamble on extremely loose fitting sweaters where the positive ease is like way bigger than anybody else, and I change needle sizes and I'm like, oh look, I'm just gonna do this on 11s of worsted weight and I'm gonna follow this number, and it's a roller coaster and you never know what you're gonna get. But the positive ease is fantastic.
And if that's okay, if you're okay with that, great.
But if it's a tighter fitting sweater, I do a gauge swatch because then I go to Rebecca and I go, fix it.
She can fix a couple things on her own. She does not always need me.
I need you to double check my math.
Well, yeah.
Because I stumble across that.
Knitting math is a thing, because then if your gauge doesn't work, but you don't want to retest it, or you've already tested it enough and you can't go any bigger on needles or something like that, then you have to do what I call knitting math, the magic math, where you have to figure out, will a different size work with a different gauge? Can you follow different directions to make it work? Something like that. But someone like Sarah Beth, like her philosophy, knowing very well that it might not work, her philosophy is if it doesn't fit, I'll give it to someone who it does fit. But then, for me, my thing with that is if I'm making things that I'm going to wear in the shop, or if I'm making things that are gifts for people, that's gotta fit.
Yeah. Or
right?
commissioned, or
Yeah.
somebody asked me to make them something and I
Yeah.
really, really like them and I really, really want to.
Alright.
Alrighty then.
Sorry. Thing happened. Restarting. Where were we? I don't remember. Yeah, huge discussion about gauge. We'll dive in wherever I remember. So I think it was that Sarah Beth will just find someone that fits, and that isn't always an option. So I like to do the testing before I start, and sometimes I don't have to test too many times. But that brings us to a couple of things. Again, we may have mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. On a lot of patterns, I saw a pattern the other day that defied the rules, and I was like, oh, that's painful. Industry standard, if there is one, tends to be talking about gauge swatch. Sometimes they'll mention stitches per inch here in the US, but more often than not, they'll talk about over 4 inches. And I always talk to, I'm remembering several things at once, sorry. I always talk to my newbie knitters and other people about that, as saying, I know that sounds like a really weird amount to measure, like measure how many stitches fit into 4 inches. An inch is a small enough measurement that it could be wackily different in different places on your garment or on your thing or on your swatch. So a larger area to measure is a little better for consistency. I would still measure in multiple places. 4 inches is because it's 10 centimeters. It's a weird amount in US lingo, but it's a nice metric amount in the metric system. It's a nice, 50 grams, 100 grams, 5s, 10s, 20s, 10 centimeters equals 4 inches. So that's the reason for that, in case you've ever wondered. And so usually on a pattern, yeah, I'm getting my train of thought back. You've never seen me lose my train of thought on one of these before, have you?
I'm just along for the ride.
Just like smile and nod, smile and nod, smile and nod. Chime in when you're like, no, that's really wrong. So on patterns, you'll often see, 20 stitches equals 4 inches. And sometimes you'll see, say, 26 rows equals 4 inches, something like that. The pattern I was looking at yesterday, it said 19 stitches is 4 inches. And then it was talking about 19 rows. And I'm like, knit stitches on average, again, a lot of on average here. The stitches are wider than they are tall. They're not perfect squares. So if you use graph paper to like make a pretty design, no, it's gonna squish when you actually go to knit it. So rows tend to not be as tall. So when it said 19 by 19, I was like, huh? It turned out someone had marked their gauge. I guess they liked the nice round, same this way as that way. So it was 4 inches and 3 inches. And I was like, that makes my brain want to explode. But I guess the pattern writer, they like the uniformity of that, the 19 and 19. But if someone wasn't paying attention,
they'd do 19 for 4 inches and
it'd be, yeah. I mean, that brings us to the point of people are like, I can't get my stitch gauge and my row gauge to both of those numbers to match what it says in the pattern. And I don't know if I've ever had both match. Maybe by a happy accident, but usually very rare. Again, everybody knits a little bit differently. You can use, the tools are uniform, but we are not. So the tension is going to change. Like how you hold your yarn, how you knit, sometimes how you knit from day to day, but we're not going to try to stress you out too much with that because stress affects that. So, but two people could say the same exact, I wish I had their little I don't have the stuff from when I used to teach. When I used to teach, I would take our little hexagons that we took the same yarn and the same hook to crochet something because we were going to work together and finish it faster. Make these little hexagons.
It'll go so much faster if we could do it together.
And what happened?
I made mine. I spent 2 years making sure all my loops were exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca picks up a hook and yarn, and wings it, which is fine. There is no right or wrong. 2 years is an awful long time to play with tension. But anyway, my hexagon fits inside of her hexagon.
Yeah, like hers is, she's a much tighter crocheter than I am. And not good or bad, but and she's probably more on gauge if she had to guess. I tend to be on the looser side for crochet. I know when I pick up a pattern, I can't assume, but there's a good chance when I pick up a crochet pattern, I want to go down a hook size or two to try to get gauge from what the pattern writer lists. But then, everybody does stuff differently. So, but yeah, we couldn't do it together because same tool, same exact yarn, completely different size hexagons. So again, that's why test your gauge. Don't just assume this size tool is going to give me something because everybody holds the yarn differently, tighter, looser, manipulates their stitches a little differently. You're going to find your own way. So what's the solution that we keep hinting at? It really is to make a gauge swatch. Like we've got 2 examples here. This one's crochet. This is actually a sample that Liz did with a yarn. I know they're both kind of dark and hard to see on camera, but they're what we could find this morning. This is not a tutorial video where I actually take the time to make it visible. So, but
these are rough guidelines.
But this has different crochet stitches in it, but it's a little square instead of a big thing, and this is a little square. And you make a square where for this one, I'll hold it a little closer so you can kind of see. Again, they're dark stitches, but all those V's on one side. It also depends. The pattern may say in stockinette, which is what the middle of this looks like. It could say in garter, if it's a garter pattern, which is knitting every row, which will actually give you a different row gauge, definitely, than stockinette. You got to see what it's telling you to do.
Stranded in the round, like you're going to do a stranded colorwork sweater in the round. We recommend doing the gauge swatch in the round. Either
make a tube, or there's some things where you can knit across and leave a long strand and then knit across again. You have to do it on circulars. It's a whole nother level of fun. But here's just for the basics what I would recommend. These are the kind of pauses I edit out in my tips and tricks videos. I'm like, I'll take that out in editing. We're not gonna do that here. Is making a little swatch and measuring in the middle somewhere. And another thing, because I've seen people who are like, okay, my gauge is supposed to be 20 stitches. I'm going to take this 20 stitches over 4 inches. So I cast on 20 stitches and I knit for 28 rows.
And it should be 4 inches.
And it should be 4 inches. And I'm like, I actually wouldn't do that because these things called the selvage edge, the fancy word, they use it in fabric, they use it in knitting, they use it in everything. The edge stitches will not behave like the middle stitches. So if you cast on exactly 20 stitches, you're like, I'll test my gauge and I'll cast on exactly what they say 4 inches should be, and I will knit and we'll see what happens. And then why doesn't my sweater fit? Because that worked. Because you weren't getting an accurate measurement of your stitches over the whole course of your garment, because those edge stitches can be fluffy or they can curl in, or things can happen. Yeah. Some knitters and some patterns will even say to block your gauge and swatch. So that's kind of where I draw the line, because that's where I run out of time and energy. But
some people faithfully block their swatch. Some people, if you're going to block your swatch, block it the same way you're going to block your finished product.
Yes, and we've talked about that before in videos too. Don't aggressively block your gauge swatch, like yank on it, and then say my sweater didn't fit because I didn't yank on that, or vice versa. So this actually, if I measure, I've got different measuring handy dandy devices here. We'll talk about that too in a second if we have time. the outside edge of this one of our handy dandy measuring devices is like 5.5 inches. So this swatch is much bigger than 4 inches. But honestly, that's going to give me a good measurement inside of it to measure my 4 inches fairly accurately. Like if the gauge said 20 stitches equals 4 inches, I would probably cast on about 30 personally and start to going to town on that, because then I've got 20 inches in the middle, not
20
affected.
stitches.
I always do that. I switch this is what she's here for. This is why I pay her the big bucks.
Translator.
Yeah, because I always say inches when I mean stitches. Do what I mean, not what I say.
Mm-hmm.
I have 20 stitches in the middle that I can accurately measure without any curling or pulling that's going to happen by the edge to see if I'm getting 4 inches. Someone in Knit and Chat once said, okay, the gauge said, let's take that 20 by 28. And my 20 stitches is only 3 inches. Like they measured the 20 stitches instead of measuring how many stitches fit into 4 inches. They took it the opposite direction and said, my 20 stitches is not measuring is measuring less. What do I do? We'll get to that in a second. So, which was, I thought, a very creative way. It shows how all of our brains work differently. Because I usually measure over either 2 or 4 inches and do the math to figure out how many stitches do I have? Is it the right number of stitches? If not, what do I need to do? I've told the story before and I will tell it again. I will tell it every day of the week, and Liz could probably tell it now too because she's heard it enough times.
Yeah.
The very first sweater I knit, I had my size, I want to say they were like size 7 circular needles from Walmart, and I had my acrylic yarn, and I was like, I'm gonna do it this the right way, so I'm gonna knit a swatch. Never mind, it was in the round and my swatch was flat, and luckily my purl stitches are consistent with my knit stitches and it doesn't really throw that off too much. But what I found in my little swatch that I knit and I measured, and I was only measuring 1 inch, which already was an issue because that's a really small measurement to try to get accuracy. I was supposed to have 7.5 stitches to the inch, and I had 7. And I said, okay, because here's the, I'll repeat this multiple times before we're done, although we need to wrap up kind of soon, actually. I did the head logic of, okay, I have 7 stitches filling this space. I need 7.5 stitches in the same space. My stitches need to shrink to fit more stitches because everyone's brains flip the logic on this. It's if I need more stitches to fit into the same space, we're not expanding the space any, but we need more things to fit in there. They must be smaller to fit into that space. So my head went, okay, I'll just knit tight. I'll pull my tension tight and I'll force my stitches to be smaller and I'll be fine. It's a 1/2 stitch over 1 inch. That's not much.
The sweater was how many inches around?
50 inches. See, I'm flipping my stitches in inches.
So 25 stitches.
There's
difference in the circumference of the sweater.
It was, and go back to the math and go back to that 7 stitches. 25 stitches. We're talking about at least an extra 4 to 5 inches in there. The thing was a dress on it. I followed the directions to the letter, but my gauge, who can consciously knit tighter to the right gauge? It took, over a sweater for a 6 foot tall man.
It took me 2 years to make sure all of my stitches were the same. But like, I couldn't imagine taking a project and trying to knit tighter because like every time you pick it up, if you're happy, you're a little looser. If you're stressed, you're a lot tighter.
You get distracted by what you're watching.
Yeah.
You forget to knit tight.
Yeah.
And the tight knitting might not have even been on the right gauge anyway.
Yeah.
You know what would have solved that problem for me? I needed smaller stitches. I should have gone back to, Walmart was my only option at the time. This was many years ago where LYSs weren't even in my vocabulary. I should have gone back to Walmart and bought a size 6 needle and tried again. But I think I didn't want to spend the money. And I get that. I respect that. But if your gauge is off, it's off and it's going to affect. People will be like, oh, it's 1 stitch. Now what I do is I do the math. I find where the number of torso like right here, how many stitches you're supposed to have on your needle. And I'll go, look, this is what is going to happen. I will divide that number of stitches by what your current gauge is, and we'll find out how much it will be off by. And you go, oh.
And sometimes it's like,
sometimes it's okay.
Like the sweater that I started, and I'm like, hey, this is my gauge. And you're like, okay, it's going to increase your.
I did the magic math.
She did the magic math. And it was going to give me, instead of being like an inch positive ease, it was going to give me like 3 inches positive ease, which for the sweater and the style and whatnot isn't too bad, but is a little bit more than I wanted. But was I going to rip back? No. So,
you take on, you figure out what level of work you want to take on, right? So these are all of our fun. This is my old one to show off, but these are all of the things we have that will help you measure gauge in the shop. And what I want to point out is they are all flat, as in, like, we have measuring tapes here that are wibbly wobbly, flexible. That's great for measuring on you things you want. I prefer things that are rigid and flat to measure my gauge, to put down on the table. You guys can't really see them back there, but to put down on the table and lay something flat over so that my swatch is flat. And letting you in a little hint, sometimes I cast on those 30 stitches and I knit. I don't necessarily knit a square. Sometimes I lose the will to knit on that. But I need enough rows that if I'm going to attempt to test my row gauge, it won't be curling, or
you need at least a good 2 inches.
2 inches or so.
You don't need
more, is better.
Yeah, you don't need like 20 inches.
I had someone who brought in 1 inch worth of knitting and asked me to test their gauge.
And that's difficult because it's still on the needles, and
the needles, if it's close enough to the needles, that's going to, like, you can't lay it flat. It's gonna force it up on the needle to try to measure. If there isn't enough that you can flatten it comfortably under these little windows, which are perfect. I'm bouncing around now, but it's because I had to walk away from the camera for a few minutes, so we're running out of time. Both of these have little windows that you can lay flat on top of your knitting. But if you don't have enough length to the knitting, it's going to curl up. It's going to be really hard to count your stitches. If you have enough, try to show you, this is not flat, so this is not the best way to measure, but if you have enough, you can lay this right over it. You can line it up with your V's, like have the edge of a V right up against the edge of this rigid surface. And you can count this one, Susan Bates. All of these are online, by the way. Shock face. I'm shameless plug. You can line it up with your V's, and you can see exactly how many V's fit into this is a 2-inch window. So there is some math involved because I would count. It separates them out so you can see them more clearly. Count how many, multiply by 2 if you're trying to hit a 4-inch gauge. Same thing with the rows. Again, I have had the V's have the bottom and the top edge that are kind of, top is over here, bottom's. Pick whatever is easiest for you to be able to count and calculate. And I will often use the tip of a needle instead of my finger, because my finger tends to be wider than the stitch and I'll lose track of where I am, but I will point and count. And this has, sizes your needles too. Wonderful.
And I try and make my gauge swatch big enough that I can do, especially if I only have the 2-inch, I can check in several places across my little swatch, because I found like 1 or 2 places will have the same number, but then there'll be a third place in there that's kind of wonky. So I try and get at least 2 out of 3 to match up.
I'll do, it's like the knitter's version of when you're in carpentry, it's measure twice, cut once. It's measure 2 or 3 places and take the best average, Same thing when I'm counting stitches, like I'll count multiple times and I'll take the best 2 out of 3, that kind of thing. So this one also has, if this window is misleading and you're having trouble and you're like, I'm not sure, is it 2.5? Is it 2 3/4? You can measure the whole 4 underneath here. But again, when it's flat, it means it's not going to wrinkle or move on you while you're measuring, or there's less likelihood of that.
And you want to lay it on like a table. if you put it on a carpet or your leg or
I've tried measuring on my
your
leg
arm,
and I've gotten a very different measurement than on a table.
You kind of need almost the slippy surface to allow that elasticity to pull it back in on itself. If you put it on the carpet or on your leg, your pants, you can inadvertently stretch it out a bit, like just the stitches grabbing hold of the fabric.
It, yeah.
Yeah.
Or try to over your leg be like, this is how many stitches.
And all of us have done that.
Probably why my sleeves came out shorter. I thought it was the right length. I might have been measuring on the couch instead of on a good surface. But I got the measurement I wanted, so I stopped. Live and learn. This one, the Chowgu came out with, so this is a little bit floppy, but when putting it on a flat surface, it can be wonderful. When I ordered these, I'm like, oh, they're the 4 inches. That's perfect. Careful. They're 4.5 inches, this window. So don't just blindly measure, like count your stitches. It will be wrong. I did that with someone at a lesson. I was like, that's really weird. Oh, it's because it's 4.5.
The centimeters is actually 11 centimeters.
Yeah, instead of the 10 centimeters. It's got a centimeter side and an inch side. The Susan Bates has a centimeter top, but only inches on the window. This is multi measuring system friendly. And it's got the measuring along the sides and for needles and hooks. It's really great. So we've got these. These are wonderful. And then we have the kind of cheat method, which is kind of fun too. I just got these up online. Whoopsie. This only works for knitting. This is not crochet friendly. This is meant, there is a ruler on the side. It's hard to see it because, it's clear, but there's a reason it's clear. It has a ruler on the side for crocheters, but it's meant for knitters because it's called the handy gauge ruler because it has white and black marks. I'll get it closer to the camera. Look at that. It's got white and you can only see the white when it's against my sweater, but you might see the black against my face. It oddly kind of V-shaped little marks on it. And what you would do is you would lay it over your knitting and try to line up these little marks to wrap around your stitches. And if they wrap around your stitches evenly, you can estimate, again, this is so dark, it's kind of hard to do it, the knitting I have, but that's why the white ones are there. The glare from the lights and the count, I would do it differently. But you can estimate, it'll tell you how many stitches per inch. Again, I would do it in several places to figure out, multiply it by 4 to match your pattern if your pattern is talking about 4 inches. But this one, again, I have to find something that's not going to go against the glare. I think this one measures out to be about 5 stitches per inch, which is the 20 stitches we talked about. But it's really fun because instead of having to count your stitches, you try to move it around till it matches and it tells you. And it's fairly accurate. I mean, it's got 4 stitches per inch, 4.5, 5. It goes from teeny tiny like sock stuff up to maybe a bulky, not a super bulky. So it only works in a certain range, but it's called the handy gauge ruler. This one is like 5 something. It's under $6. The Chowgu one is $13.50, but there's like charts on it and different weights of yarn. This is a reference guide too.
Yeah.
It's really fun. I've ordered more because we only have a handful left in the shop. But all of these are ways to try to figure out if you have the right gauge. And we need to wrap up, and I had all these I was like, if we need filler, I've got yarn colors to show off and pom-pom colors. So we're teasing you all with that. Maybe we can talk about it on Tuesday if we remember. But here's the thing to remember. The really big thing to remember for visual spatial thinkers is, okay, I have 4 inches. I have this rigid space, and count your stitches. If your number is smaller than it needs to be, like there's 16 stitches there and there needs to be 20, that's a big difference, right? You need more stitches to fit into this space. The space is not going to change. The size of your stitch needs to change. You need more stitches. That means so people hear more and they think I need to go to a bigger needle. More, bigger. No. more stitches have to fit into that space, which means they need to get smaller. Like your 16 stitches needs to go like this to make room for 4 more stitches. Your stitches need to get smaller, so you need a smaller needle.
And if you have too many stitches, you need to go to a bigger needle.
You see, the brain wants to flip this. It wants to make
I've listened to Rebecca do this so many times. I can tell you exactly what you need to do as long as neither you nor I overthink it. Because
that's the problem.
The minute somebody goes, wait, then my brain goes, wait.
Like say there
that doesn't make sense.
20, say there are 24 stitches in this space and you needed 20. You need fewer stitches in that space. So most people hear fewer and they think bigger needle. Actually that's right.
Yeah, that is right.
Never
fewer, mind. But you think
fewer, smaller.
Smaller.
See. So people think a smaller number of stitches, therefore they need to go to a smaller needle. It's actually the opposite. It's the way I said it. You need fewer stitches. Like the stitches need to be bigger to fill the space. You really need to think about it spatially.
Yeah.
I need a smaller number of stitches, but that means the stitches need to be bigger. So I need a bigger needle. And we will say it a million times over because we'll trip ourselves up with this.
It's a question that no matter how many times we go over, it's a thing.
It's a thing. And we need to remind ourselves of the thing ourselves and to tell other people. Anyway, so the shop should be open right now. So we need to wrap up. So join us tomorrow night for virtual sit and stitch in the evening, only on Zoom. Shop number 828-877-3550. And it's 6 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time because we are in the Eastern Standard Time Zone. The Saturday event that only happens once a month. The Friday thing happens every week. January 23rd, 2 days time. We're going to have our Saturday afternoon sit and stitch where we'll see if I make a sock or if I work on 6 million different things.
It's crapshoot every time.
I have high hopes and ambitions, and then I do whatever I do. But you could always weigh in, and maybe I'll do what you suggest, or maybe I'll say, no, I like what I'm knitting on. So that is going to be from 1 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on both Facebook and Zoom. Same shop phone number for Zoom. Facebook, just find us, find the Sundragon Art and Fiber page, and you should see it live. And join us. It's fun. Get more information on our Facebook page for that. If you've enjoyed our conversation about gauge, give us a thumbs up. Check these out online. I think I have a category that's called needle, hook, measuring, gauge, swatchy things. Something like that.
Swatchy things.
Swatchy things. No, I don't think I use that lingo, but that's kind of, look for something like that. It's under Notions. I tried to organize it a little. And we need to go.
I'm sorry, I'm masking up.
She's like, I need to go in case someone walks up and
because generally they walk up and neither one of us are.
We got a phone message that we have to go listen to. Subscribe, tune in. We'll see you next week. The reason I mentioned this is if you want us to talk about something else, we can revisit. Like maybe we'll come back to yarn substitutions next week if we don't get more advice questions.
Or we might just sit and knit for 45 minutes.
We talked about that. Just sitting and knitting and trying not to talk and seeing what happens.
That could be fun.
That's hilarious. 45 minutes of that, our brains all might explode. Bye.
We couldn't sit quiet for that long.
Okay, we'll see you guys. Bye.